They say some loyalties don't fade. They simply wait for the right moment to be seen. In a small town buried under snow and silence, an old veteran, a grieving mother, and a German shepherd would cross paths in a way that rewrote everything they believed about loss and fate. Before you hear what that dog carried back from the battlefield, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because what happens in this story might just stay with you long after it ends. The first snow of November blanketed the town of Maple Hollow like a silent promise, turning every sound into a whisper. The road that led out past the last flicker of the streetlights curved toward the woods where few people ever went. That's where Mrs. Clara Jennings was headed, clutching a pot of chicken soup under her arm, steam trailing behind her like a ghostly thread. She was 70, with silver curls tucked beneath a knitted hat, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the handle wrapped in an old dish towel. The air smelled of pine and cold iron, and every crunch of her boots on the frosted dirt made her wonder if she'd lost her mind walking this far alone. But Clara Jennings was not a woman easily frightened. Widowhood and the quiet ache of missing her son had stripped fear from her years ago. Now there was only this stubborn softness that made her do things others called foolish, like bringing soup to a man everyone else in town had given up on. His name was Thomas Reed, though most called him that old vet out by the ridge. He'd served in the army decades ago, came back with more scars than stories, and never quite rejoined the world. He lived alone except for a German shepherd named Ranger. The stories about the dog changed depending on who told them. Some said Ranger had bitten a man who tried to sell firewood. Others swore he sat by the road at sunset, staring west as if guarding something the rest of them couldn't see. Clara didn't believe gossip. Her son Caleb had been a soldier too. When he died overseas 15 years earlier, she learned how easily people feared what they didn't understand. A mother knows better. She knows that pain doesn't make you dangerous. It just makes you quieter. The cabin appeared through the thin veil of falling snow smoke rising weakly from its chimney. Its windows glowed faintly, and an American flag, frayed and sun-bleached, hung limply from the porch post. Clara climbed the creaking steps and knocked. No answer. She waited, feeling the bite of cold creep into her fingers, then knocked again. Still nothing. Just as she was about to set the soup down and leave, she heard the slow, steady sound of claws on wood. Out of the dimness beneath the porch came a large German shepherd fur mottled with gray eyes, sharp and amber, like pieces of autumn trapped in the cold. He didn't growl, just studied her as if deciding who she was. Clara froze, heart thudding, then slowly crouched, speaking softly. "Hey there, sweetheart. You must be Ranger." The dog tilted his head, taking a few careful steps forward. Then, without warning, he disappeared behind a broken chair and re-emerged carrying something in his mouth. He padded toward her, sat, and dropped the object at her boots. It was an old baseball half covered in frost. The leather cracked, the stitches faded. Clara frowned and picked it up, brushing away the ice. There, faint but clear, were 2 carved letters, CJ. Her breath caught. The world seemed to tilt for a second. Caleb Jennings. Her son had carried a baseball just like this, the one she'd sent him in a care package right before deployment. It had gone missing after his death, lost somewhere in the sand, she'd thought. Yet here it was, resting on a porch in Wyoming, in the jaws of a stranger's dog. Before she could process it, the cabin door creaked open. Thomas Reed stood there, tall but slightly bent, a man built from stubbornness and old sorrow. His hair was silver, his beard untrimmed, his eyes as pale as the sky before dawn. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said quietly, voice rough as gravel. "Storm's coming." Clara straightened, clutching the pot. "I heard you'd been under the weather," she said. "Figured you could use a hot meal." He looked from her face to the soup, then down at Ranger, who had settled beside her with his tail curled neatly around his paws. "He brought you that?" Thomas asked, nodding toward the baseball. She nodded. "It's strange," she said softly. "My boy had one just like it, Same marks, same initials. Thomas's gaze flicked to the ball and lingered. For a moment, something in his expression faltered. Then he stepped aside. "Come in before you freeze to death." Inside the cabin smelled of cedar and smoke. A small fire burned in the stone hearth, throwing amber light over stacks of books and a dusty guitar resting in a corner. Clara placed the soup on the table and unwound her scarf, her breath still visible in the cold air. Ranger followed, settling near the fire with a low sigh. Thomas poured her a cup of weak coffee from an old percolator and sat across from her, the silence heavy but not unfriendly. "Haven't had company in a while," he said. "Folks don't come up here much." "Maybe they should," Clara replied gently. "Solitude's a fine place to visit, but a hard place to live." He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. The kind a man gives when he's forgotten how. The flames crackled softly. She noticed a framed photo on the mantel, a group of young soldiers in desert uniforms. One man in the picture looked hauntingly familiar, though she couldn't place why. "You served with the 119th Infantry?" she asked. Thomas looked up sharply. "How'd you know?" "My son," she said, slowly, voice trembling. "He wrote about a unit stationed near Al-Hilla, mentioned a reed once in his letters, said you had a dog that never left his side." Thomas stared at her silent for a long time. The snow thickened through the night, swallowing the road Clara had just walked hours earlier. By morning, Maple Hollow was sealed in white silence, every rooftop glistening like glass. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to orange embers, and the smell of cedar lingered in the air. Clara sat by the window, wrapped in a wool blanket that Thomas had quietly placed around her shoulders when she fell asleep in the chair. The pot of soup was nearly empty now, and the world outside was buried under inches of frost. When she stirred awake, Ranger was sitting a few feet away, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that startled her at first. His ears flicked. His tail moved once, then stopped. Thomas was by the stove, stirring the ashes back to life. "Storm hit harder than they said," he murmured, glancing toward the window. "You might be stuck here until tomorrow." Clara rubbed her eyes and smiled faintly. "I've had worse company." Ranger's tail gave another soft thump, like he understood her words. She reached her hand out carefully. The big dog approached his paws, soundless on the wood floor, his breath warm and steady. He lowered his head, pressing it against her knee, and she felt the slow rhythm of his heartbeat against her leg. "He's not usually like this," Thomas said, his voice half a whisper. "Doesn't trust easily," Clara smiled. "Maybe he just knows a grandmother when he sees one." The veteran turned back toward the stove, his shoulders relaxing slightly. For a moment, it almost felt like they were a family again, 3 survivors from different wars of their own. The air between them softened, no longer sharp with distance. As Clara poured 2 cups of coffee, she noticed Ranger moving toward the back corner of the cabin, where the wall was lined with old pictures maps and a few yellowed letters pinned beneath a knife blade. Her eyes caught on one of them, a folded piece of paper with familiar handwriting. She froze. The slant of the ink, the loop of the capital C, the way the letters ran together, it was unmistakable. Her son's handwriting. "Where did you get this?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling as she pointed at the note. Thomas stiffened. "That," he said without turning around. "Found it after the war, in a supply crate near Hilla. Didn't belong to anyone I knew." Clara rose, her heart hammering in her chest. "That's my boy's," she said, moving closer. Her fingers brushed the edge of the paper. The letter had browned with age, but the words were still legible. "Tell Mom I'm all right. The dog here's smarter than any of us. I think he misses someone too." Thomas stood still, his eyes locked on the flickering flames. "I didn't know," he said finally. "Didn't know whose it was. I kept it because..." He trailed off, swallowing hard. "Because it reminded me of something worth holding on to." Clara turned to him, tears welling up. "That's his writing, Thomas. He mentioned your dog, your Ranger, in his letters. Said he'd never seen an animal so loyal. Thomas's voice softened. He was right. Ranger never left Cole's side, not even when he stopped the words cutting off like a wound reopened. Ranger lifted his head at the sound of his name, eyes bright, ears perked. Then in one slow motion, he rose and walked over to Clara, placing his paw gently on her lap. His nails clicked softly against her teacup. She looked down and met his eyes, and something in her chest broke open. There was recognition there, something wordless but certain, like the way a song you've forgotten can still make you cry when you hear it again. She reached up, resting her hand against the fur behind his ear. "You knew him, didn't you?" she whispered. "You were with my boy." Ranger gave a low, deep sigh, then rested his head on her knee again. Thomas sat down across from her, eyes shadowed. "I didn't know your son personally," he said, "but my partner did, Sergeant Cole. He and your son must have crossed paths. Ranger belonged to Cole back then. When Cole died, Ranger wouldn't leave his side. The unit had to drag him away. When we got sent home, they gave me the choice, put him down or take him. I took him." He looked at the dog, then his jaw tightening. "Sometimes I think he's been waiting for someone ever since." Clara stared into the fire, her hands trembling. "Maybe he was waiting for me." Thomas didn't answer. The wind howled against the windows, and Ranger moved closer, his fur brushing her hands. The cabin felt small, but safe, wrapped in the hush of snow. For the first time in years, Clara didn't feel alone. She could sense her son here, somehow, in the warmth of the fire, in the smell of wood smoke, in the steady weight of Ranger's head against her lap. Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "He reacts to music," he said suddenly, as if needing to fill the silence. "Back in the service, Cole used to whistle before night patrol. Ranger still perks up when he hears it." He pulled a small harmonica from the table drawer and blew a single note, soft and clear. Ranger's ears twitched, and he stood instantly, tail wagging once. Clara covered her mouth. "That sound my son used to whistle, that same tune," she said, "always before writing home." Thomas blinked slowly, staring into the dog's glowing eyes. "Guess the world's smaller than it looks." When the music faded, the fire popped, throwing sparks like tiny stars into the dark. Clara glanced towards the letter again, unable to look away. She felt both closer to and further from her son than ever before. There was comfort in the connection, yes, but also a cruel reminder that life kept going, dragging even the memories into strange new shapes. Ranger lay down beside her again, this time resting his chin on her boot. His breathing was heavy, but calm, like a soldier finally off duty. Thomas poured more coffee, then sat across from her. "You've got courage," he said quietly. "Coming out here, facing all this." Clara smiled faintly, her eyes still glassy. "No," she said, "I just ran out of reasons not to." The next morning came with a silence so heavy it felt sacred, the kind that only follows a long storm. Snow weighed down the branches outside, the world muted beneath a bright white sky. The fire in the hearth had burned low, but the cabin still held the ghost of warmth from the night before. Clara woke to the smell of fresh coffee and the soft scrape of Ranger's claws on the wooden floor. Thomas was already up, sitting at the table with a small notepad and an old pen that looked older than either of them. He was sketching something, lines so faint they could have been shadows. When she stepped closer, she saw that he wasn't drawing scenes or people, he was drawing a dog. Ranger, precisely. The tilt of his ears, the curve of his shoulders, even the small nick on his right paw were captured in detail. "You're an artist," Clara said softly, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders. Thomas didn't look up. "Not really," he replied. "Just trying to remember things before they disappear." His voice carried that steady ache of someone who had already lost too much to forget. Ranger padded over to Clara and nudged her hand gently, as if to guide her back to the seat near the fire. She smiled, sitting down with her coffee, the steam curling like fragile ribbons. The letter she'd found the night before still weighed heavily in her coat pocket. She wanted to speak of it to ask more, but something about Thomas's silence made her hold her words. The snow outside was still too thick for her to leave, and deep down she knew she didn't really want to. Her eyes wandered around the room, tracing the scars of a life lived in solitude. The cracked photograph frames, the tin cans repurposed as candle holders, the wooden shelf lined with books whose spines had faded into anonymity. And then she saw it, a dull bronze medal resting on the mantel above the hearth, half hidden behind a stack of folded letters tied with a fraying string. Its ribbon was sun-bleached and stiff, the color drained out like a bruise healed too long ago. Clara rose slowly and walked toward it. The medal caught the light, and the words "Valor Beyond Duty" glinted faintly across the surface. She turned to Thomas. "This one's yours?" she asked, her voice careful but curious. He froze, his hand tightening around the pencil. "No," he said, quietly, almost too quickly. "That one doesn't belong to me." Before Clara could speak again, Ranger stood up abruptly and walked over to the fireplace. He stopped right beneath the mantel, lifted his head, and nudged the base of the shelf with his nose. The metal rattled slightly, sliding forward until it teetered on the edge. Thomas's face went pale. "Ranger," he murmured, but the dog didn't stop. He stared at the metal as if it had a pulse tail, low ears forward. Clara bent down and picked it up before it could fall, the cold metal pressing into her palm. It was heavier than she expected. She turned it over, noticing scratches along the back, and then her eyes caught on something faint, engraved numbers, worn but legible. October 14th, 06. Her breath stopped. That was the date her son had died. She blinked hard, thinking she'd misread it, but no, the numbers were clear, etched into the metal, as if meant for her to find. "Thomas," she whispered, holding it out to him. "Where did you get this?" He didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened, his eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the room. "I didn't," he said finally. Ranger brought it back. The words hit her like a physical blow. "Brought it back," she repeated, voice shaking. From where Thomas exhaled, his shoulders slumping. "From the field," he said softly. "After the explosion, after Cole, after your boy's unit went down." Ranger disappeared into the smoke. "When we found him 2 days later, he had this metal clamped between his teeth. It wasn't Cole's. We didn't know whose it was. So I kept it." He rubbed his temples, eyes wet but unshed. "Maybe I shouldn't have." Clara stood frozen, staring at the metal in her hand. The weight of it felt unbearable now. Ranger moved closer to her, pressing his head against her leg, as if trying to bridge a gap that neither of them could name. "He brought it back to you," she said in a whisper, looking down at the dog. "All these years, and he brought it back." Thomas shook his head, his voice raw. Maybe to someone else, maybe to the memory of someone he couldn't save. "No," she said, firmly clutching the metal. "He knew. He must have." Ranger gave a low, mournful sound, a sound too human to belong to an animal. The room filled with silence again, the fire crackling like the only heartbeat left in the house. Clara felt tears slide down her cheeks before she realized she was crying. She sat back down slowly, the metal gleaming faintly in her trembling hands. The engraved date shimmered under the firelight, the same date that had split her life into before and after. "He saved this," she said quietly. "He carried it across the world. And somehow he ended up here." Thomas's voice broke when he spoke again. "He's carried more ghosts than any living creature should. Cole, your boy, the rest of them, they all had a piece of him." He rubbed his hands together, his eyes locked on Ranger, who lay beside Clara, now watching her with calm, knowing eyes. "He never forgot," Thomas said. "Not once." Clara brushed her fingers over the metal again, tracing the edges like she might wake up from it all. "Maybe none of us do," she said. "We just forget how to remember." The snow outside reflected light through the window, casting ripples of brightness across the walls. For a moment it felt as if the cabin itself was breathing alive with memory, with grief, with gratitude. Clara placed the metal back on the mantel gently, as if laying a flower at a grave. Ranger followed the motion with his eyes, then rested his head on his paws, exhaling softly. Thomas turned back towards the table, but his hands shook too much to hold the pencil anymore. "You've brought more than soup into this house," he said, after a long silence. The storm broke by late afternoon, leaving the cabin wrapped in quiet blue light. The trees outside bent under the weight of snow, and every gust of wind sounded like the sigh of a world too tired to move. Inside, the fire burned steadily, its glow carving soft lines across the wooden walls. Clara sat near the hearth, with the metal still gleaming faintly on the mantel, its engraved date catching the fire's reflection like a heartbeat that refused to fade. Thomas had gone silent after their last conversation, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the window, as if watching ghosts pass by in the drifting snow. Ranger lay at Clara's feet, his head resting on her slipper, the warmth of his breath pulsing softly against her ankle. She watched him sleep, noticing again the way his back leg twitched slightly, even in rest a faint limp that hadn't escaped her since she arrived. "Does it hurt him?" she asked quietly after a long pause. Thomas didn't look away from the window. Sometimes, he said, "Cold makes it worse." "How long has it been like that?" she asked. His shoulders stiffened before he answered. Since the day everything went wrong. Clara didn't need to ask which day. The silence that followed was thick with understanding. "He saved a man that day." Thomas continued after a moment, his voice steady but dull like the edge of a blade. Cole was already gone, but one of the younger guys got pinned behind the truck. Ranger ran through the flames, dragged him out by the vest, took shrapnel to the leg for it. He never cried, just limped away and sat next to Cole's body. Sat there till we carried them both out. Clara's throat tightened, the image forming so vividly in her mind that her eyes burned. "You were there," she said softly. He nodded once. "I was his commanding officer. I told them to hold position. Should have told them to pull back sooner." His voice cracked, then a splinter of guilt surfacing like bone beneath old skin. "If I'd acted faster, Cole might have lived. Maybe your son too. Maybe even Ranger wouldn't be limping now." Clara rose from her chair, crossing to him slowly. "You can't keep fighting that day," she said. "War never ends for people like us, but we can decide when to stop replaying it." Thomas laughed quietly, but there was no humor in it. "You sound like someone who's been carrying a medal of her own." She placed a hand on his arm, her grip surprisingly firm. "I've carried worse," she said. Silence. Regret. "That's heavier than steel." Ranger stirred at her voice and tried to stand, but his back leg faltered beneath him. He gave a soft whine, and Clara immediately knelt beside him. "Easy, sweetheart," she murmured, brushing her hand along his fur. Her fingers brushed something rough near his flank, a small raised patch hidden beneath the thick hair. "He's got a scar here," she said. Thomas turned. "Yeah, that's where the metal hit him. They pulled out most of it, but some pieces went too deep." Clara squinted, parting the fur gently. A small glint of silver caught the firelight. "There's still something in there," she said, reaching for her glasses. "Looks like metal. Doesn't seem infected, but..." Her words faded when she noticed the shape. It wasn't random shrapnel. It was thin and flat-shaped, like the corner of an insignia tag. Her breath hitched. "Thomas," she whispered, holding it closer to the light. "This isn't just metal. This is part of a tag army issue." Thomas knelt beside her, his brow furrowing as he studied it. "You're sure I know that alloy?" she said. "I had to identify Caleb's belongings by it. They used this in his unit's ID plates. It doesn't corrode. The air in the room seemed to disappear." Ranger shifted uneasily, sensing their tension, and Clara stroked his fur to calm him. "He carried it all this time," she murmured. "A piece of that day. A piece of my boy." Thomas swallowed hard, his voice breaking. "Maybe that's why he limps. Not because of the wound, but because he's never really put it down." They sat there in the firelight, the dog breathing softly between them, and for a long while, no one spoke. The room hummed with memory, with the unspoken truth that grief and love were sometimes the same thing, wearing different uniforms. Clara's hand trembled as she cleaned around the scar with a damp cloth. Ranger didn't flinch. He just watched her with those steady amber eyes full of patience and understanding. "You've carried enough, haven't you, boy?" she whispered. "You can rest soon." Thomas's voice came low. He's the only one who remembers everything he said, every scream, every sound, every order. I think that's why he follows me everywhere, not because he wants to, but because he's afraid to lose what's left. "He's not the only one," Clara replied. "We all follow our ghosts in our own ways." Thomas looked at her, then really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time, not as a stranger, but as someone who spoke the same silent language. "I didn't think anyone could understand this kind of guilt," he said. "It's not guilt," she said softly. "It's love with nowhere left to go." He stared into the fire, the orange light flickering across his lined face. "Then maybe we can learn where to send it." Ranger laid his head down on Clara's knee again, his body heavy with exhaustion. The faint shimmer of metal still peeked through his fur, a small gleam that told the story of a soldier who had never stopped guarding the fallen. Clara reached out and brushed the last bit of soot from the metal on the mantel. "He carried the memory," she said, "so we could find each other." Thomas closed his eyes briefly, then nodded. "He's been trying to bring something home all these years," he said. "Maybe this is it." The wind began to change near midnight, a low hum that crept through the chimney and settled beneath the floorboards. The temperature dropped so fast that frost crept up the windows like pale fingers drawing thin lines of ice across the glass. Thomas stirred from his chair by the fire, glancing toward the window where Ranger lay curled beside Clara's feet. "That sound," he muttered, standing slowly. "It's the ridge wind. Means the blizzard's coming back." Clara tightened her shawl around her shoulders, staring at the fire that had burned down to a faint glow. "I thought it had passed," she said. "It did," he replied grimly. "But this mountain never lets things go easily." He moved to the window, his breath fogging the glass. Outside, snow was already falling in thick, heavy flakes, swirling under the dim light of the single lantern that hung near the porch. "We'll be stuck in by morning," he said, his tone flat with experience. Clara watched him stoke the fire, adding a few logs with slow, deliberate movements. She could feel something tightening in the air, a tension that wasn't just weather. Ranger lifted his head suddenly, his ears twitching. His body stiffened, and a low rumble built in his throat. Clara frowned. "What's wrong with him?" Thomas looked over. "He does that before storms. Always restless, like he's hearing something the rest of us can't." But the dog wasn't looking at the window or the fire. He was staring at the door. The wind outside groaned, and the lantern's flame flickered weakly. Then came a sound, faint but distinct. A metallic clink, like something brushing against steel. Ranger rose, hackles lifting. He walked toward the door, nose pressed against the wood tail straight. Thomas moved to stop him, but Clara's hand shot out instinctively. "Wait," she whispered. "Maybe someone's out there." Thomas frowned. No one would be out there now. The sound came again, a single tap, soft but deliberate, as if something or someone was calling. Ranger barked once sharp and commanding, then turned to Thomas as if asking permission. Thomas hesitated. "No, boy, not tonight," he said. But Ranger barked again, louder this time, then pressed his paw against the doorknob. The blizzard howled in response, wind rattling the walls. "He's not going to stop," Clara said, rising to her feet. "He's trying to tell us something." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Every time he does this, something bad follows." Clara met his eyes. "Then maybe it's time we follow anyway." Before Thomas could stop him, Ranger leapt and shoved his weight against the latch. The door burst open with a roar of wind and snow. Cold air exploded into the cabin, blowing papers off the table and scattering ash across the floor. Ranger bolted into the storm, his dark shape swallowed by the white chaos. Ranger Thomas shouted, grabbing his coat. But Clara was already at the door, her gray hair whipped by the wind. "He won't make it alone," she yelled. "Neither will you," he barked back, but she was gone before he could reach her. The snow was blinding a wall of white noise. Clara pulled her scarf over her mouth, calling out, but her voice was snatched away by the storm. She followed the faint impressions of paw prints in the drifts, her legs heavy, her breath ragged. The cold bit into her lungs, sharp as glass. Ahead, she glimpsed a flicker of movement, a shadow weaving between the trees. "Ranger," she cried again, her voice cracking. He barked once in return, a deep sound carried by the wind. She stumbled forward, half running, half falling, until she reached a small clearing near the ridge. There, under a bent oak, she saw him digging furiously at the snow, his paws throwing up sprays of white. "What are you doing, boy?" she gasped, kneeling beside him. He stopped, looked at her once, then resumed digging faster. Clara brushed at the ground beside him, and her hand struck something solid wood. She clawed the snow away until a small cross emerged, weathered and half-rotted. 2 names were carved into it, faint but still visible through the frost sergeant, David Cole and P.T. Caleb Jennings. Her breath left her body entirely. The world went silent around her, the storm's roar fading into a distant hum. She stared at the names, her gloved fingers trembling over the letters. The dates matched the same day she had seen etched on the metal, the same day burned into her memory forever. "They buried them here," she whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. "All this time, and I never knew." Ranger sat beside her, panting, his fur covered in snow. He pressed his nose against the wooden cross and let out a low, mournful sound that cut through the night like a prayer. Thomas appeared moments later, stumbling through the wind, his flashlight barely cutting through the whiteout. When he saw Clara kneeling by the cross, he stopped dead in his tracks. "You shouldn't be out here," he shouted, voice breaking. "Neither should they," she said, pointing to the names. His expression crumbled, and for a long moment he just stood there, his face half lit by the flashlight beam. "I didn't know," he said. "We thought they were moved, never knew this grave was here. The army handled everything, and I couldn't bring myself to ask." Clara ran her hand along the cross again, tracing the grooves of her son's name. "You don't have to ask anymore," she said softly. "They're home." Thomas knelt beside her, his breath heavy. He must have remembered, he said, nodding toward Ranger. "He's been trying to lead me here for years, but I wouldn't listen." Ranger sat between them, chest-heaving eyes bright with reflection from the flashlight. The snow eased slightly, the wind slowing to a whisper. Clara reached for the medal in her pocket and placed it at the base of the cross, the bronze shining faintly even in the dim light. "It belongs here," she said. "He carried it back so we'd find this." Thomas lowered his head. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "For everything, for not saving them, for keeping you from knowing." "You did what you could," she said. "The rest was up to him." Ranger turned, looking between them, then lowered himself onto the snow beside the grave. The storm quieted until all that was left was the sound of their breathing and the faint rattle of the trees. For a moment, the sky above cleared just enough for a sliver of moonlight to fall through. It landed directly on the metal, casting a golden glow over both names carved in the wood. Clara felt warmth rush through her chest, not from the cold, but from something deeper, a peace she hadn't felt in 15 years. She placed her hand over Ranger's head. The snow had calmed by dawn, leaving the forest cloaked in a thin silver mist that shimmered beneath the first pale light of morning. Clara sat near the fire, her hands cupped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. Neither she nor Thomas had slept. They had returned from the ridge hours earlier, soaked freezing and wordless. The cross they'd uncovered haunted them both, but it also left a strange, quiet peace lingering in the cabin like the air after a hymn. Ranger lay near the door, his body heavy with exhaustion, his breath slow and steady. He had not moved since they came back, not even when Thomas tried to coax him toward the fire. Clara had spent the last few hours simply watching him tracing her fingers through the fur on his head whenever she thought he was dreaming. His fur was still damp, his paws streaked with dirt, and the faint scent of earth clung to him. Thomas finally spoke. "You think he knew what that grave was?" Clara didn't look up. He didn't need to think. He felt it. Dogs know things we forget how to remember. Thomas nodded slowly, eyes tired. He led us there like it was a mission he'd been waiting to finish. She smiled faintly. And he did. For a while they sat in the low hum of silence, the world outside brightening with hesitant sunlight. The storm had left everything still, every sound swallowed by snow. Then Ranger stirred. His head lifted, ears twitching. Clara straightened. "Easy boy," she murmured, but he was already on his feet, limping toward the door. Thomas frowned. "Not again." Ranger pressed his nose against the wood, whining softly, then pawed the latch once, twice. "He hears something," Clara said. "Thomas, listen." They both fell silent. For a few seconds there was nothing but the faint crackle of the fire, and then barely audible came a distant sound. A voice, faint, muffled, and high-pitched. A child's cry. Thomas's eyes widened. "That's coming from the ridge," he said. Ranger barked once loud and sharp, then turned toward the door again. "Let him go," Clara said quickly, standing. "We have to follow." Thomas grabbed his coat and rifle. "If we get caught out again, we won't," she interrupted. "But if someone's out there, we can't wait." They pushed through the door together, stepping into a world that glowed blue with the light of early morning. The storm had smoothed the land into rolling mounds of white, and Ranger's paw prints stood out clean and deep as he forged ahead, tail low, head forward. Clara followed as fast as her legs allowed her breath, forming clouds in the air. Thomas stayed close behind, scanning the trees with sharp eyes. The voice came again, closer, now fragile and trembling. "Help!" it cried. "Please!" Ranger broke into a run, his limp slowing him, but not stopping him. He led them toward a bend in the ridge, where a cluster of pines leaned inward, forming a hollow pocket of snow. There, half buried beneath a fallen branch, was a boy no older than 10, his face pale and lips blue. Ranger stood over him, pressing close, using his body as a shield against the cold. "Dear God," Clara whispered, rushing forward. "He's alive." Thomas dropped beside the boy, removing his gloves to check for a pulse. "Weak but steady," he said. "We have to get him inside." Clara pulled her scarf off and wrapped it around the child's neck, while Thomas lifted him into his arms. Ranger limped beside them, panting heavily, but refusing to fall behind. When they reached the cabin, Clara tore blankets from the cot, while Thomas set the boy near the fire. His skin was white as snow, but color slowly crept back into his cheeks as the warmth spread through him. "He must have wandered off from town," Thomas said. "But no one comes up this far. What was he doing here?" Ranger settled beside the boy, licking his hand gently. The boy's stirred eyelids fluttering open. His voice came out hoarse. I saw a light," he whispered. "I was looking for my grandpa's place." Clara froze. "Your grandpa David Cole?" the boy murmured weakly. "He used to live out near here, right? Mom said this was where he trained his dog." The silence that followed was absolute. Clara and Thomas exchanged a stunned glance. "What's your name?" son Thomas asked. "Evan," the boy said faintly. "Evan Cole." Ranger let out a low, trembling sound, half whine, half breath, and pressed his head against the boy's chest. Clara covered her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. "Thomas," she whispered, "he's Cole's grandson." Thomas's throat worked, his voice barely steady. That means he brought him back," she said, staring at Ranger. "All this time he's been trying to bring him home." Thomas sat heavily in the chair, staring into the fire, as if seeing the past unfold right there in the flames. "He followed that bloodline through scent memory or something else. I'll never understand," he said softly. "He never forgot Cole, and when the boy came near, he knew." Clara knelt beside Ranger and ran her fingers through his fur. "You old soldier," she said, voice trembling. "You finished what you started." The boy coughed weakly, opening his eyes again. "Is he your dog?" he asked. Thomas shook his head. He's everyone's now. Clara smiled gently. He belonged to your grandfather once, and maybe to my son for a moment, too. The boy looked confused but smiled faintly as Ranger nudged his arm again. He feels warm, Evan said. Like he knows me. He does, Thomas said quietly. You remind him of someone brave. Hours passed as the boy recovered by the fire, sipping broth from Clara's hands and wrapped in layers of blankets. Ranger stayed pressed against his side the whole time, as if afraid the cold might steal him away if he moved. When the sun rose higher, Thomas stepped outside to call the local sheriff's office on his old radio. Static filled the air. Then a thin voice crackled through, confirming a missing child report from town, a boy named Evan Cole, who had wandered off the trail near dusk the previous day. Relief washed through Thomas as he relayed their location. When he returned inside, Clara was sitting beside the boy, humming a tune softly under her breath. It was the same melody Thomas had played on the harmonica 2 nights earlier, the one Cole used to whistle. The boy's eyes fluttered closed, his breathing even now. Ranger's head rested across his legs, eyes half open, but peaceful. He's safe now, Clara said, because of him. Thomas nodded, kneeling beside Ranger and running his hand down the dog's back. You never stop saving people, do you, old friend? He murmured. Ranger's tail moved faintly, a single tired wag. He looks tired, Clara said softly. He'll rest soon, Thomas answered. He's earned it. For a while, the three of them sat in the gentle quiet, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the boy's soft breathing. Outside, the forest glimmered beneath the sun, the snow sparkling like a field of glass. The call to the sheriff crackled through the static, like a memory trying to be remembered, each word half lost in the hum of old radio lines. Thomas's voice, low and steady, filled the cabin as he confirmed the boy's name and their coordinates near Maple Hollow Ridge. Clara sat near the fire again, her hands folded over the sleeping child's blanket. Ranger still lay close, head resting gently on Evan's chest, the rise and fall of their breathing perfectly synchronized. It was as if 2 heartbeats had found the same rhythm across generations, one just beginning and one nearing its rest. Outside, the wind carried faint echoes of voices from the radio tower and the crunch of approaching tires through snow. Help was coming, but neither Thomas nor Clara moved. They both understood something sacred was happening in that stillness, something that didn't need to be rushed. He shouldn't have survived the night, Thomas said quietly, glancing toward the boy. No child could have lasted that long in that cold. Clara smiled faintly. He didn't survive it alone. She reached down, brushing a bit of frost from Ranger's fur. He never left him, not for a second. Thomas nodded, his eyes softening as he crouched beside them. That's the second time he's done this. First Cole, then the boy. He keeps finding them. Maybe they're the same story, Clara said. Different pages, same book. Her words hung in the air for a moment, echoing softly. The dog stirred, then his collar jingling faintly. The sound drew Clara's attention. The metal tag had caught the light of the fire, glimmering gold for a split second. She reached for it, gently turning it over between her fingers. The engraved letters were worn smooth by time, but still clear. Sergeant D. Cole, 7,294. She traced them with her thumb, feeling the indentation like a pulse under her skin. Then she noticed something else. Another faint series of numbers etched just below the first, barely visible, except under direct light. She squinted, her breath catching. Thomas, she whispered. Look here. He leaned close, his brow furrowing. What is it? There's another number, she said. It's newer, scratched in by hand, 04242013. He stared for a moment, then frowned. That's impossible. Why, she asked. That's the year Evan was born, Thomas said. Clara blinked, stunned. Are you sure, positive? He said, grabbing the folded report on the radio table. The sheriff had faxed the missing child's information to confirm his identity. There it was, in bold, Evan Cole, born April 24th, 2013. The exact same digits on Ranger's tag. Clara looked at the sleeping boy, her heart pounding. How could that be, she whispered. Thomas's face was pale in the firelight. I don't know. Maybe someone updated it. But who? Ranger lifted his head, then eyes half-lidded, but focused like he'd been listening all along. His gaze met Clara's unwavering, deep, as the years between wars. He was waiting for this boy, she said, all this time. Thomas rubbed the back of his neck, struggling for words. That would mean he knew somehow. But dogs don't. Maybe not all dogs, Clara said softly. Just this one. The sound of engines interrupted them. 2 sheriff vehicles pulled up outside, their lights cutting through the pale dawn. The door creaked open, and Sheriff Dalton stepped in, brushing snow from his hat. He was a tall man with the kind of weathered face that looked carved from old stone, but his eyes softened when they landed on the child. "You folks saved him," he said, kneeling beside Evan. "We've been searching all night." Thomas nodded toward Ranger. "We didn't. He did." The sheriff smiled faintly. "That's so. Let's see this hero." He reached out to pet the dog, then froze mid-motion, his brow furrowed as he looked closer at the tag. "Where'd you say you got this dog?" Thomas hesitated. "He came back with our unit years ago. The Army said he was too old for redeployment, so I brought him home." The sheriff turned the tag over in his hand, squinting at it. "You mind if I take a look at something?" He stepped outside to his vehicle, returning a minute later with a laminated photo folded into his notebook. He laid it on the table. It was a black and white image, grainy with age, showing a small platoon posing in front of a truck. 3 soldiers crouched in the front row, and beside them sat a young German Shepherd alert, proud tail curled neatly at his side. "This was taken in Iraq 2006, the sheriff said. "We have it on file because Sergeant Cole was from this county. This is the last picture taken before his team went missing." Clara leaned in, her breath shallow. The dog in the photo was unmistakable, the same alert eyes, the same patch of white fur above the paw. "That's him," she whispered. "That's Ranger." The sheriff nodded slowly. "That's what they called him then too, Ranger. Officially declared MIA along with the rest of the unit. We thought he died in the explosion." Thomas's voice trembled. "He didn't. He came back 2 days later, covered in soot, half his ear gone. I never asked how." The sheriff exhaled, studying the old photo. "You realize what that means, don't you? This dog is nearly 20 years old." The room fell silent. Clara looked at Ranger, who lay now with his head on his paws, eyes half open but calm. "He shouldn't be alive," the sheriff said quietly. "Most shepherds don't live past 12. Thomas swallowed hard. "He's lived on duty his whole life," he murmured. "Maybe that's what's kept him here." The sheriff looked down at Evan, who was now waking slowly, blinking in confusion at the unfamiliar faces. Ranger's tail brushed weakly against the floor. The boy smiled. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. "Did I dream you saved me, no son?" The sheriff said softly. "You didn't dream it." Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks. "He saved more than you," she said. "He saved all of us." Ranger lifted his head, then his gaze sweeping the room like he was making one last silent head count, confirming every soul was safe. Thomas knelt beside him, resting his hand on his neck. "You can stand down, soldier," he said, voice breaking. "Mission accomplished." For a long moment no one spoke. The fire hissed softly, and the light through the window brightened as the sun climbed higher. The sun had climbed high by the time the sheriff's truck disappeared down the snowy road, leaving deep tire tracks that glistened in the melting frost. The cabin was quiet again, the kind of quiet that feels earned. The storm had broken. The air was sharp and clear, and the woods glowed golden where sunlight spilled through the trees. Inside, the fire still burned low, though its warmth seemed unnecessary now. Clara sat on the wooden bench near the window, her gaze fixed on the small figure of Evan Cole sleeping peacefully beneath a thick wool blanket. His chest rose and fell in even rhythm, and his small hand rested lightly on Ranger's back. The dog hadn't moved for nearly an hour, his breathing shallow but steady. Thomas stood by the table, holding the radio in one hand, listening to the static between transmissions. "Sheriff said the Army's reaching out," he murmured. "They're sending records, maybe even a unit representative. They said there's something we ought to know." Clara nodded absently, her eyes on the old metal that still gleamed faintly beside the fire. "He's already told us everything that matters," she said quietly. Thomas set the radio down and turned toward her. "You think he's—" His voice faltered, unwilling to finish. She looked at Ranger, then the silver in his fur almost glowing under the morning light. "I think he's waiting," she said softly. "He's always been waiting." The knock came hours later, light but deliberate. Thomas opened the door to find a man in uniform standing there, hat tucked under his arm, snow dusting the shoulders of his coat. His name tag read Lieutenant Harrison. He introduced himself with quiet formality, then stepped inside, holding a sealed envelope. "Sheriff Dalton asked me to deliver this," he said. "It's from the Department of Veterans Affairs. We recently reviewed Sergeant David Cole's case file." He looked down at Ranger, his expression softening. "This must be the dog," he said quietly. "The one who never came home." Thomas gestured toward the table, and the officer sat opening the envelope carefully. "There was a service for Cole's unit back in 2007, Harrison explained. "At Fort Collins. The names of all lost soldiers were engraved on the memorial plaque, including the K-9 partner listed as Ranger. He was declared deceased the same day." Clara's eyes widened. "They engraved his name." "Yes," the officer said. "No one knew he survived. Records show an unidentified shepherd was later found near the extraction zone, but no one connected the dots." Thomas rubbed the back of his neck. He came back to camp on his own, limping, covered in ash. No tags. I didn't realize what it meant. The lieutenant smiled faintly, his eyes glassy. "The dog was officially one of us. A soldier. Valor beyond duty was awarded posthumously to Sergeant Cole and his K-9. That medal," he nodded toward the mantle, "was his." Clara covered her mouth, her eyes brimming. "He brought it back home," she whispered. "He carried it all these years. Looks like he wanted to return it himself," the officer said, voice trembling slightly. "Not many soldiers get that chance." Thomas looked down at Ranger, whose head now rested between his paws. His eyes were half closed, his breathing slower, gentler. "He's been fighting a long war," Thomas said softly. "It's time he rests." The officer nodded. Then he should have proper honors. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small American flag, folding it neatly on the table beside the medal. The gesture was simple, almost ceremonial, and yet it filled the room with reverence. Ranger stirred faintly at the sound of the flag being placed down. His paw twitched once, and his ears flicked. Clara knelt beside him, her fingers brushing the fur along his neck. "You can rest now, boy," she whispered, her voice trembling but tender. "Your job's done." Evan woke then, blinking groggily. "Is he okay?" he asked, voice still weak. Clara smiled through her tears. "He's tired, sweetheart," she said. "He's been protecting people for a very long time." The boy crawled closer, sitting beside the dog. "Thank you," he said, his small hand resting gently on Ranger's paw. The old shepherd lifted his head, just barely, eyes meeting the child's. Then something extraordinary happened. With slow, deliberate motion, Ranger raised his paw, pressing it softly against Evan's chest, right above the boy's heart. Thomas gasped quietly, and Clara felt a shiver run through her. The dog held it there for a moment, then let it fall back down, his breathing shallow but peaceful. The lieutenant wiped his eyes discreetly, whispering, "That's a salute, if I've ever seen one." Clara smiled faintly through her tears. "He's saying goodbye." The boy leaned forward, his voice soft. "You can see Grandpa now," he said. Ranger's eyes flickered once glinting gold in the firelight. His chest rose, fell, and then went still. The silence that followed was absolute, gentle, complete. Clara bowed her head, tears spilling freely. Thomas placed a trembling hand on the dog's back, whispering, "Rest easy, Ranger. You've earned it." The lieutenant unfolded the small flag and draped it gently over the dog's body. Then, with a soldier's precision, he straightened and gave a slow, solemn salute. Thomas followed suit, his hand shaking as he raised it to his brow. Clara didn't move, just kept her hand over her heart, whispering a prayer she hadn't spoken aloud in years. Evan watched quietly, eyes wide, understanding more than his age should have allowed. "He's not gone," the boy said softly. "He just went where Grandpa is." Outside, the sky began to turn gold as the sun sank behind the ridge, painting the snow in shades of amber and rose. The metal on the mantel caught the last ray of light, shining as bright as fire before fading back into shadow. For a long time, no one spoke. The fire crackled softly. The flag barely stirred, and time itself seemed to hold its breath in respect. When the lieutenant finally stepped outside, he turned once more toward the cabin. "We'll make sure he's honored properly," he said. "He's a hero in every sense." Clara nodded, unable to speak. When he was gone, she knelt beside the old shepherd once more. "You found them all," she whispered. "You brought us home." Thomas stood behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder. Morning came softly, with thin streaks of light filtering through the frost-covered window panes. The world outside the cabin had turned still again, the snow glinting like powdered glass beneath the rising sun. Inside, the air was heavy but gentle, the way a church feels after a prayer. Ranger lay by the hearth, covered now by a woolen blanket and the small folded flag that Lieutenant Harrison had left behind. The metal still rested on his chest, catching the faintest glimmer of firelight from the dying embers. Clara moved quietly through the room, her every step deliberate and careful, as if afraid to disturb the silence he had left behind. Thomas sat at the table with a cup of untouched coffee, his weathered hands wrapped around it, as though seeking something warm to hold on to. Evan slept on the couch, clutching one of Ranger's old toys in his small hands, his face peaceful but streaked with dried tears. The cabin, though full of people, felt empty in a way that words could not reach. "It's strange," Clara said softly, breaking the quiet, "how a house can feel more alive when something's gone." Thomas looked up slowly, his voice rough but steady. He filled every silence without ever saying a word. He glanced towards the hearth, his eyes tired but bright. "I keep expecting him to walk over, lay his head on my knee again." Clara smiled faintly, wiping her eyes with the edge of her sleeve. Maybe he still does. Outside, an engine rumbled in the distance, followed by the crunch of boots on snow. Thomas rose to his feet as two uniformed officers stepped onto the porch. One of them carried a folded piece of paper, the other a small box. "Mr. Reed," the first officer said, as he entered, removing his hat respectfully. "We received authorization this morning. The Department of Defense will be holding a joint ceremony this afternoon in honor of Sergeant David Cole and his K-9 Ranger. They'll both be listed together finally properly." Clara pressed a trembling hand to her lips. "He'll have his name carved beside his partner's," the officer continued. "The county's never done it before, but they said it's long overdue." Thomas nodded, his throat too tight for words. "He'll like that," Clara whispered. The second officer handed the small box to Thomas. Inside was a polished bronze tag with the inscription, "Ranger Valor Beyond Duty." Thomas traced the letters with his thumb, his voice cracking. He already knew who he was, but thank you. The officers saluted quietly and left the house, their boots crunching over snow until the sound faded away. Clara stood near the hearth, staring at the still shape beneath the flag. "We should get ready," she said. Thomas nodded and turned to gather a few things: a folded towel, a clean cloth, the collar that had once hung loosely around Ranger's neck. When he lifted it, something small slipped out and landed softly on the floor. Clara bent down and picked it up. It was a piece of folded paper, yellowed at the edges, the ink faded but legible. "It's a letter," she said. Thomas froze. "What letter?" She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the words. Her breath caught halfway through. It's in your handwriting." His face drained of color. "I thought I burned them," he said quietly. "Letters I wrote after we came home, never meant for anyone to read." "You wrote this one to him," Clara said, her voice trembling. "To Ranger." She began to read aloud. "I don't know how to thank you for saving me that night, not from bullets or fire, but from myself. I was ready to go where Cole went, but you wouldn't let me. You dragged me back when I tried. You sat there until morning, and when the sun came up, you looked at me like I still had a reason to breathe. I guess you were right. I'm still here, because of you." Thomas sat down heavily, his head in his hands. "I wrote that 15 years ago," he said hoarsely, "after the nightmare started. I couldn't live with what I saw. He'd wake me when I screamed, press his head against my chest, till my heart slowed. He kept me alive when I didn't think I deserved it." Clara folded the letter carefully, her eyes glistening. "He saved us all one at a time," she whispered. Thomas nodded. "I guess he never stopped being on duty." Hours later, they loaded the old truck and began the slow drive toward town. The roads had thawed and the snow glowed gold beneath the afternoon sun. In the back of the truck, wrapped gently in the blanket and flag, Ranger's form lay still, the metal resting atop him. Evan rode beside Clara, holding the folded letter in his lap like a treasure. When they reached the town square, a small crowd had gathered near the war memorial. Soldiers stood in crisp uniforms, hats pressed to their hearts. Townsfolk from Maple Hollow lined the sidewalks in silence, some carrying flowers, others just bowing their heads. The sheriff stood at the front, eyes misty. The mayor stepped forward, reading from a prepared note. "Today we honor not only the men who served, but the companions who stood beside them. Ranger partner of Sergeant David Cole served beyond duty, beyond life itself, carrying memory, courage, and loyalty across generations. May his name remind us that some heroes have 4 legs and a heart that never quits." The soldiers saluted as a bugler played taps, the notes echoing through the cold air. Thomas stood stiffly, his hand raised in salute while Clara held Evan close. The boy looked up at the stone as the new plaque was unveiled. Beneath Cole's name, fresh engraving shimmered Ranger K9 Unit 119th Infantry Valor Beyond Duty. Evan stepped forward, placing the small toy car on the stone. "For you," he whispered. The crowd remained silent, the wind carrying the sound of his words like a prayer. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed, Thomas and Clara lingered by the memorial. The sheriff approached quietly. "We're setting up a permanent display at the precinct," he said. "The photo, the medal, the story, it'll be preserved there." Thomas smiled weakly. "That's good," he said. "He'd hate to be forgotten." "He won't be," the sheriff said. "Not after this." When the sun began to dip again, the light turned the names on the stone to gold. Clara took one last look at them. Her, son Sergeant Cole, and Ranger, all carved together at last. "He's home now," she whispered. Thomas nodded. "He's where he belonged." On the way back, the road was quiet, except for the soft hum of the truck engine and the occasional cry of a distant hawk. Evan had fallen asleep again, clutching the folded letter in his hands. Clara looked out at the passing fields, her reflection faint in the window. "You ever think," she said, "that some souls are too loyal to leave until they finish their job?" Thomas smiled faintly, eyes still on the road. Spring returned to Maple Hollow quietly, in soft shades of green and gold. The snow had melted weeks ago, leaving the earth damp and rich with new life. The cabin that once stood cold and haunted now breathed with warmth and sound again. Flowers grew along the porch steps where frost used to cling, and the sound of hammers and saws echoed faintly from the clearing behind the house. A new building was rising there, small but strong, with a hand-painted sign hung proudly above the doorway, "Rangers Haven Service Dogs for Healing Hearts." Thomas stood in the yard, wiping his hands on a rag as he watched a group of volunteers unload kennels from a truck. His once quiet home had become a place of purpose. The Army had offered him an award, but he refused it. Instead, he asked for the funds to start something that mattered, a program that trained dogs to serve veterans and children who struggled with trauma, just as Ranger had served them all. Clara arrived a few moments later carrying a box of donated collars and blankets. She had grown stronger these past months, her grief softening into gratitude. "You worked too hard for a man who swore he was retiring," she teased. Thomas chuckled. "If I sit still too long, I start hearing him barking at me to move." "He probably would," she said, with a smile setting the box down. Together they looked toward the ridge where the last of the snow still lingered in shaded patches. The memorial stone could be seen faintly through the trees, its golden lettering glinting in the sun. "We did good," Clara said softly. "He'd be proud." "He already was," Thomas replied. "Every time he looked at us like we were worth saving, that was pride enough." Inside the cabin, Evan was at the table, drawing pictures of dogs with crayons, his tongue poking from the corner of his mouth in deep concentration. On the paper, one of the dogs wore a medal around its neck and had the same white patch above its paw. Clara leaned over his shoulder. "What's his name?" she asked. "Ranger 2, the boy said without hesitation. "He's gonna help people too," she smiled, brushing his hair back. "I think he already is." Outside, the first group of trainees arrived, 2 veterans, both walking stiffly, both looking uncertain. Thomas greeted them with a firm handshake and a kind smile. "You're in the right place," he said. "We don't fix people here, we just remind them they were never broken." They nodded their eyes, scanning the open field where kennels waited, where the memory of a single dog had built something new. As the afternoon light stretched long across the ground, a sound broke through the chatter, a sharp, playful bark. Everyone turned. From the edge of the woods came a blur of tan and black fur bounding clumsily toward the yard. A young German Shepherd pup, maybe 6 months old, galloped across the grass, tail wagging wildly. "Where did he come from?" Clara asked, laughing in surprise. "No idea," Thomas said, bending down as the puppy skidded to a stop in front of him. The pup dropped something at his feet, an old weathered piece of metal. Thomas picked it up slowly, and his breath caught. It was Ranger's tag, the one buried with him. He turned it over, and the engraved letters were unmistakable. Sergeant D. Cole, 7,294. "Impossible," Clara whispered, covering her mouth. Thomas stared at the pup, who sat wagging his tail as if waiting for approval. "Where did you get this, huh?" he said softly. The dog barked once, then leaned forward and pressed his nose against Thomas's knee. Clara knelt beside them, tears already forming in her eyes. "He found his way back," she said. "Or maybe he was never really gone." Thomas smiled, his throat tight with emotion. "Welcome home, soldier," he whispered. The puppy wagged his tail harder, letting out a small, eager whine. Evan ran outside at that moment, his face lighting up. "Can we keep him?" he shouted. "Please," Clara laughed through her tears. "I think he's already decided that." Thomas looked towards the ridge again, the setting sun painting the trees gold. "Maybe some spirits don't stay buried," he said softly. "Maybe they just change form to keep watching over us." As evening fell, the new center filled with life dogs, barking people laughing, the smell of pine and fresh paint hanging in the air. Clara hung a framed photo of Ranger above the door next to the words, "Valor Beyond Duty." Beneath it, she placed the letter Thomas had written all those years ago, the one Ranger had carried beneath his blanket. Visitors would stop and read it, some wiping their eyes, others smiling quietly. It became the heart of the place, a reminder that loyalty was not measured by years, but by moments of grace. A few weeks later, the foundation officially opened, and the press arrived to cover the story. Thomas spoke briefly to the crowd gathered under the bright morning sky. "We built this for him," he said, "for every dog who stands beside a man when no one else will. Ranger taught me that love doesn't end. It just finds new orders. Every time a life is saved here, every time a child smiles again, that's his doing. That's his mission continuing." Applause rippled through the crowd, soft but heartfelt. The puppy barked once at the sound tail wagging proudly. After the ceremony, Clara and Thomas stood alone near the flagpole as the volunteers cleaned up. The air was warm and wildflowers had begun to bloom along the edges of the field. "Do you think he knows?" Clara asked. Thomas smiled faintly. "He's always known." The breeze stirred, then lifting a swirl of petals through the air. For a fleeting moment, the sound of a single bark echoed faintly from the ridge, low, steady, and unmistakably familiar. Clara looked towards the trees, eyes shining. "Good boy," she whispered. "You did it." As dusk settled over Maple Hollow, the last light of the sun struck the photo above the door, making it glow. In the picture, Ranger sat beside Sergeant Cole, proud and alert, the horizon wide behind them. The image shimmered briefly, catching the same golden hue that painted the hills. And in that final quiet, the message felt clear and whole, that some bonds are built not in life or death, but in the space between, where love never fades and duty never ends. The end. Before we end this story, take a deep breath and think about what you just witnessed. A story of loyalty that outlived war, heartbreak, and even death itself. If this story touched you, if Ranger's journey reminded you that love and duty never die, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us tell more stories like this, stories that remind us that courage can live in any heart, and that some heroes walk on 4 legs. I'd love to know what you think. Which moment in Ranger's story hit you the hardest? Was it when he led them to the hidden cross in the snow, or when he raised his paw one last time in that silent salute? Tell me your favorite part down in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how stories like this reach hearts all over the world.